Hello, everyone. Welcome to our latest staff seminar. Absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Nicolas Lamp. As you know already, Nicolas is an associate professor at the Faculty of Law at Queen's University, not this Queen's, the one in Ontario, Canada. He also previously worked as a dispute settlement lawyer at the WTO Appellate Body Secretariat. With that kind of profile, it's not surprising that he's published extensively in the area of international law and WTO law, and in particular lawmaking at WTO level. But today he'll be talking about his book, which is co-authored with Professor Anthea Roberts. As you know, it's entitled Six Faces of Globalization: Who Wins, Who Loses, and Why It Matters. And it was published last year with Harvard University Press. It's an extraordinary book. I'm a big fan, as Nicolas already knows. I've got my copy here just to prove it. Extraordinary book, explores various narratives and conceptualization surrounding economic globalization, and addresses some of the key issues and challenges that arise from this. Received numerous accolades, and from my perspective, on a personal note, it's really made me question some of my own preconceived ideas about globalizations and the institutions and rules that underpin it. So in terms of the format, we'll follow this standard format. So Nicolas will start with his presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So what I'd ask all the attendees to do is to ensure they're muted and turn off their cameras, although I think that won't be a problem since that's done by default. And that's that for me. So Nicolas, again, welcome, and I'll hand over to you now.
Well, Billy, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for that generous introduction. I was saying to Billy earlier, it's a particular pleasure to present at Queen's University Belfast, because I've been numerous times been mistaken for an academic who teaches in Belfast. When people see Queen's University, particularly in Europe, they typically think of Belfast. So it's wonderful to finally visit you. So the book, as Billy said, is called Six Faces of Globalization. And I want to talk a little bit about how we got to work on this project. It really goes back to 2015 and 2016, when both Anthea and I got the sense that the traditional consensus in favor of globalization was crumbling, was starting to crumble. On the one hand, in Europe, you had massive protests in Germany particularly, but also other European countries against the TTIP agreement, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between the European Union and the United States. And then, of course, in 2016, you had the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom. And then in the fall, Donald Trump's election to the US presidency. And so suddenly we had critiques of globalization that had been there at the fringes all along, suddenly making their way in the political mainstream. But what really prompted the book was not so much just the emergence of these new currents of thought about globalization, but also the reaction from the mainstream. And we felt that, particularly in our profession, among international economists, international economic lawyers, there was a lot of dismissiveness and even contempt for these new rival accounts. And you can understand that on an emotional level, especially because, of course, some of Trump's campaign was really obnoxious, and he betrayed his economic illiteracy on many occasions. But what we felt very strongly is that just trying to hit them over the head with facts and data and long reports was not going to cut it. You had to engage with the stories that these movements were telling about globalization, and also in order to understand why they resonate. And that's really what we're trying to do in the book. We're trying to look at these and take these narratives at face value, and try to understand the internal logic and to see why they might appeal to certain people. And Anthea came up with this metaphor at the beginning that what we're really trying to do in the first part of the book is to take all these different arguments about globalization that are flying around, and they seem like the different colors of a Rubik's Cube, and to untangle them, to solve this Rubik's Cube, unscramble the Rubik's Cube, so that we can more clearly see the different narratives that are in play in the debate. We start out with the establishment narrative. We call it the establishment narrative because it's the narrative that you would hear from organizations such as the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, but also most of the mainstream parties in the West prior to 2016. And the argument here is basically that globalization is going to make us all better off. Yes, some are going to gain more. You see it in our little graphic here. Those at the top are typically going to gain more. Those in the bottom less. But the job of dealing with that is something for domestic policy. If we grow the pie, and which globalization allows us to do, we all can be better off, right? So I already mentioned these are the key proponents of this narrative. And if there was one graph which exemplifies this narrative, it's this one, which shows that living standards was basically hovering around subsistence levels for hundreds of years, for millennia, until we had the Industrial Revolution. We had the first wave of globalization, which allowed everyone to become more productive, to specialize in what they did best. And now we have this hockey stick of prosperity, which has made all of us so much immeasurably better off. And it's not just the developed world. It's not just the West is benefiting. One of the favorite data points for the establishment narrative is the fact that over the past 30 years, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in India and China particularly. So it's something that is working for everyone. It's reducing absolute levels of poverty. Well, what about all those jobs that have been disappearing from Western countries, or the good manufacturing job that have been going away? The establishment story on that is that it's not really about trade, it's about innovation. And so the graph that they often point to here is this one, which shows that even as in the United States, even as manufacturing employment has been falling precipitously after 2000, manufacturing output has still been growing. So this is really a story about US manufacturers being able to produce more with fewer workers. It's really a story about innovation and technological change. But the first challenger narrative to that is of course the one promoted by Trump and people like Peter Navarro, who look at the same facts and don't necessarily contest the facts, but they point to a particular set of winners and losers, right? So in this, indicated with the red arrows here, that in their story, it's the workers in developed countries that have been losing because the workers in developing countries, and particularly countries like Mexico and China, have been stealing their jobs. And this is a screenshot from Peter Navarro's documentary, Death by China, which makes it really clear. It shows how the jobs are being shipped from the United States to China by multinationals. And what's really interesting about this narrative is that it conceptualizes work and jobs very differently than the establishment narrative. For the establishment narrative, jobs are something you do to make money. And if somebody else is better at it, then you just move on to doing something else that you're better at. And so there's nothing particular, and the particular job you have at any one point has no particular significance. But the right-wing populist narrative of Trump recognizes that people are actually attached to their jobs. In some of the manufacturing communities, people have worked in industries for generations. They're invested. Their status in the community, their sense of self-worth is connected to their job. And so when their job disappears, is shipped overseas, it really feels like something has been stolen from them. And it really feels like the job is their property and it has been taken away from them. And so if Trump comes along and says to them, you've been robbed, you've been wronged, they've stolen your jobs, there's something fundamentally wrong happening here, that resonates because it chimes with that sense of loss that many of these workers experience. The other big difference between the establishment narrative and the right-wing populist one is that the establishment narrative really looks at the economy in the aggregate. And so if you look, for example, at the change in furniture employment in the United States, it's hardly perceptible in this period of high globalization in the early 2000s. But if you look at particular communities, or even states like North Carolina, communities like Hickory, you see that it has a devastating impact. And the reason manufacturing jobs are so important is because they often have a multiplier effect. So if you have a manufacturing job, they're often service sector jobs like restaurants, cinemas, hairdressers that come along. And so if the manufacturing job disappears, all these service sector jobs disappear as well. So as Peter Navarro has described it, there's a black hole that opens once the manufacturing jobs disappear and everything else gets sucked into it. And the most striking manifestation of this phenomenon is probably the rise of what are known as deaths as despair among white non-Hispanic in the United States. You see that even as death rates have been falling across the developed world, in the United States, they have been rising precisely starting in 2000 with that period of the disappearance of manufacturing jobs. But there's also another story that comes from the left. And one of my initial interests in the project was to actually disentangle the right-wing critique of globalization from the left-wing critique, because it might appear that Trump and Bernie Sanders are essentially just saying the same, but we argue that they don't. Because the left-wing critique of globalization, which manifests itself in this left-wing populist narrative, which arose particularly after the financial crisis and the Occupy Wall Street, with the Occupy Wall Street movement, is that it's not really the workers in other countries who have been ripping us off. It's the elites. And the problem is not so much with the global economic system primarily, but rather with the domestic economy, which is rigged, right? So the left-wing populists look at this very same graphic, and they argue that it's the rich who have appropriated most of the gains from globalization. And the key graph for this narrative is, I think, this one, which shows that around the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s, the productivity growth that the establishment narrative is so proud of, right, that the establishment narrative champions, and that is facilitated partly by globalization, has not trickled down to workers, because the wages which were growing along with productivity after the Second World War stopped keeping up with productivity growth in the late 1970s, early 1980s. There are many reasons for that. The proponents of the narrative point to anti-union laws. They point to the fact that the minimum wage has been falling in real terms in the United States. They point to many other policies, which rampant financialization, for example, which has allowed the top 1 or 10% to appropriate most of the gains from globalization. But this is a very different story than the one that the right-wing populists tell. So the key concept here is that the problem is that we have a rigged domestic economy. The result can be seen in the share of national income in the United States. We have this nice cross which shows that the top 1% are receiving a higher, since the mid-1990s, the top 1% is receiving a higher share of national income than the bottom 50%. And of course, Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are some of the key proponents of this narrative. At the same time, we also have another critique of globalization that's emerging, particularly starting around 2018, 2019, with Trump's trade war with China. And that is not primarily concerned about particular workers, but it's really concerned about competition between countries. And the basic argument here is that globalization has allowed developing countries, and particularly China, for example, to catch up with the developed world and even overtake it. And so that the economic interdependence that has been facilitated by globalization means that US has allowed China to become a strategic and technological and economic competitor. And that's dangerous. Why is it dangerous? Well, the basic point of this narrative is that international economic dependence is fine as long as you're talking about friends and allies. But if you have reason to mistrust your economic partner, it's actually dangerous, because economic interdependence creates vulnerabilities. And this became most glaringly obvious in the case of Huawei, when countries were considering whether to allow Huawei to build their 5G networks. And Australia was actually the first country to realize that if they allowed Huawei to build that 5G network, they would give China enormous leverage over Australia, because this new telecommunications infrastructure is not something that could simply rip out once it's in place. And it provides opportunities for sabotage, for espionage, for blackmail, and the Australian intelligence agencies decided that they simply couldn't do it. It was simply too dangerous to allow this to happen. And there's a real shift here from seeing international economic interdependence as something that promotes peace, as something that is irresponsible, where you don't, if you don't have peace to begin with, if you're dealing with countries that you mistrust. The underlying concern, of course, with China is here that China is growing in economic way that's overtaking the US as in terms of the share of world GDP measured in purchasing parity terms. And this growing mistrust towards China is also manifesting itself in other areas. So, for example, in terms of investment, CFIUS is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States that screens inbound investment, and you see the investigations shooting up around 2008, and since then, the scrutiny of inbound foreign investment has been becoming ever stricter, and that's a huge difference again to the establishment narrative, which sees investment as a great thing, right? It brings jobs, it brings money into the economy, whereas the geoeconomic perspective is that we actually have to look very closely who's investing into what. We also see with the Trump administration a renewed interest in the resilience of the supply chain, right? So Peter Navarro would always point out in how many sectors the US is dependent on Chinese supplies. And so if there was some kind of armed conflict between China and the West, China would be able to cut off these supplies and therefore do great harm to the United States' ability to keep manufacturing and keep its defense at full strength. There's another narrative on the left, which some people have criticized as and said is actually like just another version of the left-wing populist narrative. We do see it as a bit differently because it is a much more transnational narrative. And so I'll start explaining this narrative by looking again at these demonstrations in Europe that happened in 2015. And these demonstrations really presented a puzzle because Germany is a huge beneficiary of international trade, has a huge trade surplus. So why would Germans be protesting a trade agreement? And the answer is that the German population was not objecting to the trade part. What they were objecting to were aspects of the agreement which they feared would give corporations power over governments. And so I just want to mention three aspects of that. The first one is investor-state dispute settlement, the mechanism that allows corporations to sue governments when they take actions which diminish corporations' profits. Another one is regular corporation, which sounds very innocuous, but the fear of European activists was that regular corporation would allow US agribusiness corporations to influence European regulations and therefore, for example, make it possible to export hormone-treated beef or genetically modified organism into the EU. And so that's something that they were worried about. And the final aspect was control over intellectual property. Right? So the basic argument here was that free trade agreements are not really about free trade anymore. They're really about giving power to corporations. And so that was the aspect of these agreements that the protesters were objecting to. And so the basic argument here is that the best way to think about the winners and losers of globalization is not to think in terms of individual countries or even about individual subgroups within those countries, but rather we have to look at classes transnationally. And at the bottom, we have the transnational working class. At the top, we have the corporations and their owners. And so this crocodile graph shows that over the past 25 years, what has been happening is that the labor share of income has consistently been falling, whereas profits of corporations have been going up. Another aspect of this narrative that is the regulatory and tax competition that happens between countries, because as corporations can move around the globe freely and produce anywhere and export anywhere they want, they gain the power to play off workers and governments against each other, right? So they can play off workers against each other because they can say, well, if you don't agree to lower wages or to keep your wages low, we're just going to move to another country. But they can also go to governments and say, if you don't lower your corporate tax rates, we're going to move to Ireland or somewhere else and pay lower taxes. And I think the area of corporate taxation is the area where we have the clearest evidence of that kind of dynamic, and that probably also explains why the OECD countries have gotten together and agreed on that minimum corporate tax rate recently. A final aspect of this narrative, which has been receiving increasing attention, especially under the Biden administration, but also in Europe, is in renewed interest in antitrust. So there's an awareness of the power of tech corporations to engage in anti-competitive behavior, but also take actions which can undermine democracy and have very problematic results. And so this renewed interest in antitrust and potentially breaking up these corporations or regulating them like public utilities is also an aspect of this corporate power narrative. And finally, there's one narrative which sees these other narratives as kind of fighting over the spoils on the Titanic, which is sinking, right? Which is essentially saying that, look, yes, there are these economic questions about who wins and loses in economic terms, but if we take a broader look at what's happening, we're all going to end up losing. And that is because our current economic model is unsustainable. Again, this is a narrative that has become very powerful in recent years, thanks to, in large part, Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movement, but also, of course, the work of international organizations, which show that hockey stick of global prosperity that I showed you at the very beginning, which was the key part of the establishment narrative, also corresponds to a hockey stick of global carbon emissions, which shows that we simply cannot continue in this way if we want to survive on the planet. While we were working on the book, there was, of course, another global threat that emerged in the form of the pandemic, which prompted another narrative in this global threats framework, which was not so much just about sustainability, but also about resilience. So the shutdowns that happened in China at the beginning of the pandemic put the resilience of supply chains into focus, but then there were, of course, also the huge demand shocks, the huge demand suddenly for personal protective equipment, later on for vaccines, which really made countries doubt the just-in-time supply model that had been the hallmark of the establishment narrative. So this narrative essentially says that we can't continue on our current path, because what we're doing is we are overshooting our ecological ceilings, and we are at the same time not providing the social foundation that we need to survive. And so this is a graph from Kate Raworth's book, Donut Economics, which shows that really what we should be trying to do is to end up in the safe and just space for humanity that is on the donut. So that's the broad overview of the 6 narratives that we discuss in the book. And if we look at them all together, we can see that there's the optimistic win-win narrative at the top. Then there are 4 different versions of a win-lose narratives, and finally we have a lose-lose narrative at the bottom. We also see these narratives reflected in the news. I subscribe to The Economist, and I just kept noticing that these narratives come up in the covers. So we have the establishment, the optimistic establishment narrative, the left-wing populist one, the right-wing populist one, about those who have been left behind by globalization. So many covers recently about the rivalry between US and China, about corporate power, and finally, again, so many different covers about climate change or the COVID-19 pandemic. Once we had these narratives, we started looking at what countries do with the narratives, countries and politicians do with the narratives. And one example that we found particularly telling is how different politicians take the same set of facts, but by using different narratives, they draw attention to different aspect of that factual picture. So this is Branko Milanović's elephant graph, and it shows the relative rise in income over 2 decades of intense globalization from 1988 to 2008. And we have highlighted here 3 points on that graph. At point 1, you have the rising Asian middle class at around the 60th percentile of the global income contribution. At point 2, you have the middle and working classes in developed countries, and at point 3, you have the booming global elite. And so, well, what does the right-wing populist narrative do? It looks at the middle classes and working classes in developed countries who've lost their jobs. They're still relatively rich in global terms, but they've not been benefiting over the past 20 years. And then it directs the attention to the people at point 1 and says, those are to blame. It's the workers in Mexico, the workers in China who've been stealing your jobs. And so they are the problem. Whereas the left-wing populist narrative of Sanders, we agree that you had a rough deal in the past 20 years at point 2, but who's really to blame are those at the top. They've been appropriating all the gains from you and workers all over the world. And so the point of focusing on narratives is to say that it's not just a debate about facts and the right facts. It's really what the story that you tell about those facts really matters. The protagonists that you identify, the villains and heroes, and the causal stories that you tell, but also how you evaluate those. And that's something that these narratives do very differently. Once we had disentangled the narratives, we started trying to work with the narratives and see, well, how could they actually help us analyze concrete political problems. And I found this helpful. Even since we published the book, there have been a couple of issues that have come up where I found this very helpful to do. And one is the semiconductor shortage. You've probably heard about the chip shortage that came about as a result of the pandemic. Europe has said it will invest $2 billion in chip production. Trump has been blamed for the crisis in part. The auto industry has not been able to produce. The US put export restrictions in place. So lots of stuff is happening in the context of this crisis. And we try to use our narratives to make sense of that. And we've thought that 3 narratives are particularly helpful here. They have slightly different names than I gave you earlier. So the protectionist one is really the Trump, the right-wing populist one. Resilience narrative is this one variant of the global threats narrative. And what you can see is that they all agree on the importance of investing in domestic manufacturing capacity, although they do so for different reasons. For the protectionists, it's mostly about jobs, bringing jobs back to the United States. That's why you want to invest in domestic manufacturing capacity. For the geoeconomic narrative, the concern is dependence on a strategic competitor. And for the US particularly, the concern is that lots of advanced semiconductor manufacturing is happening in Taiwan. And well, so what if China was ever trying to invade Taiwan and take control of that capacity? That would be fatal to the US economy, to the tech economy. Particularly in Europe, you see yet a different narrative, the resilience narrative, which says, well, we can't afford having our car companies and their factories sitting idle because they don't have enough chips. So we have to have a resilient chip supply. We can't be dependent on imports all that much. And so they all converge on this imperative to invest in domestic manufacturing. But they also made differences. So for example, from the protectionist perspective, one way to get more manufacturing going is to restrict imports. And so that's what Trump did. He imposed tariffs on Chinese chips as part of the trade war and thereby restricted imports, which doesn't make sense if you're concerned about security of supply. It doesn't make sense from a resilience perspective, for example. In the case of the United States, the export restrictions that the US imposed, also the Trump administration imposed, the objective here was not necessarily to help domestic manufacturers. In fact, restricting your exports decreases demands for the products and therefore hurts your manufacturers. These export restrictions were motivated by an attempt to hobble a strategic competitor, in particular Huawei. Right, so the U.S. wanted to keep Huawei down, and therefore one way of doing that was to restrict its access to semiconductors. Right, so you can see here clear different policy prescriptions from the different narrative. We also saw some export restrictions based on resilience grounds to secure domestic supply. It was particularly early in the pandemic, for example, we saw export restrictions on PPE, which had a different motivation than the export restrictions to hobble a strategic competitor. The resilience narrative would say that one response to the crisis is to diversify sources of supply. But there's again a key difference here to the geoeconomic narrative, which would say, well, we can diversify, but if you diversify, you have to go just to allies. Like, it doesn't make sense to diversify, say, from different producers in China, because then you just increase our dependence. So there's a clear difference in emphasis here. If you're just concerned about resilience, you will diversify no matter from where. If you're concerned about geoeconomics, you will try to ally shore to diversify, but just among allies. If you're worried about just temporary shocks, then it makes sense to invest in stockpiling. If you're trying to decouple in the long term, stockpiling doesn't really provide a solution. And as I mentioned earlier, for the geoeconomic narrative, inbound foreign investment is a huge issue, a concern that foreigners are going to take control of your high technology companies, whereas for the protectionist narrative, the concern is really outbound investment, that manufacturing is going to happen in other countries. Finally, the protectionist and geoeconomic narrative, they share this zero-sum conception of trade, like one country is going to win, one country is going to lose. Whereas the resilience and protectionist narrative, they share concern for the well-being of workers, although there's a difference in which workers they care about. So the protectionist narrative, Trump mostly cared about manufacturing workers, whereas for the resilience narrative, we saw a lot of emphasis on essential workers, which are often also found in the service sector. So the narratives give us a sense of where, of how we can make sense of these different policies that were adopted in response to the crisis. I don't know how much time I still have. I wanted to talk briefly about how we can use these narratives to make sense of what's happening with Russia, and how particularly the geoeconomic narrative that is really coming to the fore in relation to Russia compares to the debate that we've been having in respect to China. Because it's been really surprising. We've been talking for many years now about potential decoupling between the West and China, but the real decoupling that we're now seeing happening is the decoupling between the West and Russia. So some people have asked, well, is this the end of globalization, the Ukraine war? The answer is probably going to be no, but as Ian Bremmer put it, it's in some ways it's the end of globalization for Russia, because Russia is highly dependent on imports. Many of these imports are being cut off either because they can no longer pay for them because of the banks are being expelled from Swiss, or because companies are withdrawing from the market, or because there are export restrictions. And as a result, you are seeing like an extreme deglobalization in a very short time for Russia. One striking difference between the talks about the discussion of decoupling from China and Russia is the role of firms. In the case of decoupling from China, firms have been very reluctant to go along with this, with the idea of decoupling. Whereas in the case of Russia, many firms actually was very proactive in leaving the market. And so I've been thinking about what accounts for this difference. And I think one of the key factors is that for many firms, Russia is a consumer market primarily, an important consumer market, but it's just a consumer market. So withdrawing from the market is not necessarily existential. Whereas for many firms, China is first and foremost a production location. It's also a very important consumer market, but it's also a production location. And we saw in the context of the trade wars, when Trump was imposing all these tariffs on China, that many companies that were asking for exclusions from those tariffs were saying, well, we can't really produce this anywhere else. We don't have the capacity, we don't have the scale, we don't have the skill in any other country. So if we're not allowed to produce in China, we are facing an existential threat. And so a lot of what has been happening is in response to the trade war is in fact some transshipment, so that components that were produced in China were then shipped to Vietnam. And we saw, in fact, the U.S. trade deficit with Vietnam ballooning in response to the trade war. But it's much harder for companies to leave China. There's also a key difference in the way in which these debates about decoupling and the geoeconomic narrative in these two contexts interacts with the global threats narrative, in particular the climate crisis. So when it comes to China, I think people in the climate world see the talk of decoupling from China as really problematic for ability to address the climate crisis, simply because China has such an important role in renewable energy supply chains. And we see that like the cheap solar panels are all coming from China. So if you're imposing tariffs on those, we actually make it more difficult to transition away from fossil fuels. With China, the situation is, of course, with Russia, it's very different, because the objectives of decoupling from Russia, the geoeconomic objective here of decreasing vulnerability, dovetails with the objective of decarbonizing the economy. And so if we again look at the narratives here, at the Western policy responses to the Russian invasion, suddenly we have an agreement from different narratives about the need to invest in energy efficiency. Right? So when an electrification and in renewable energy generation, that is, for example, in Germany, the new government was mostly talking about investment in renewable energy in terms of a response to the climate crisis. Now it's also talking about that response, about that move in response to the Russian aggression as something that's very important for German national security. Of course, it will also make us more resilient. Right? We talk, even in Canada here, the concern is not so much about dependency on Russian oil and gas, because we don't import any, but about the high prices, the high gas prices that are determined by the world market, right? And so one way of insulating ourselves against those higher prices is to transition away from fossil fuels. But again, they're also different. If your concern is mostly vulnerability and resilience, then you will also invest in fossil fuel production and transport from other sources, right? And so we see that tension in German policy at the moment, right? At the same time as we're trying to accelerate the transition to renewable energy, the Minister of the Economy also goes to Qatar and tries to find alternative sources of natural gas. Whereas if you're mostly concerned about resilience and accelerating the transition, but don't worry so much about China, then you'll try to increase imports from China in order to facilitate the transition. So again, there are key differences in terms of which narrative comes to the forefront. Whereas from a geoeconomic perspective, and that we see that very clearly in the United States, the US is trying to build supply chains that exclude China in transitioning to renewable energy. Okay, just a final few remarks about, in the last 5 minutes, about what kind of project that is and what are the broader lessons we can take from this project. And we started out with the Rubik's Cube, but we realized later on when we were working on the book that the cube was actually not a great metaphor for guiding policymakers, because it exemplifies how we can tell the narratives apart. So it provides an analytical framework about thinking about what the different narratives are. But in order to use these narratives in developing and criticizing policy, it's actually much better to see them as to use the metaphor of a kaleidoscope, where you look at one issue through different lenses and through different colors. And a concept that exemplifies what that would look like is the concept of integrative complexity. So integrative complexity, as conceptualized by Suedfeld and others, has two steps. So first, you have to identify the different perspectives, which we did by disentangling, unscrambling the cube. But then you also have to try to integrate them in some way. So we have to understand, well, how can we look at the issue, a particular issue, through these different perspectives? And where do we then see overlaps between the different narratives, and where do we see incommensurabilities and trade-offs between them? And we think that's a very promising way to approach a complex issue such as globalization. Because if you approach it just from one perspective, then you're bound to disregard all the other aspects of the problem, and you're also bound to devise solutions that are insensitive to some of the other values that animate others. And so the book ends with an argument for approaching complex issues such as globalization, such as the COVID-19 pandemic or the climate crisis, with this integrative complexity that tries to first say, okay, what are the different ways in which this issue is perceived, and how can we try to bring them together in our policy response? another metaphor that we use in order to exemplify this approach is something that we borrow from Philip Tetlock, which he calls dragonfly eyes. So we as humans, we have two eyes and that are integrated, whereas dragonflies have hundreds of eyes, which give them hundreds of lenses, which give them an almost 360-degree view. And so what we are saying we need to look at these issues is through dragonfly eyes. We have to try to see them through all these different perspectives in order to, not necessarily because we agree with all of them perspectives, you don't have to agree with all of these perspectives, but you have to know how what you're trying to do is being perceived from other sides. And that will allow you to devise a solution that is more sustainable. Right? Just to give one example, when Emmanuel Macron implemented his diesel tax, that approach made perfect sense from an establishment perspective, right? You have an economic externality, pollution, so you price it, so you put a tax on it. It also made sense from a sustainability perspective, right? If you increase the price of diesel, then you have you reduce consumption and you further your climate objectives. But if you had looked at it from the perspective of the left-wing populist or the right-wing populist narrative, you would see this policy very differently. Like for the left-wing populist, it would say, okay, you're not taxing aviation fuel, for example, right? So all the rich city dwellers who live in Paris and just fly on to vacation, they are not paying for this. It's the poorest parts of the population who are paying this tax mostly. And from the right-wing populist perspective, it's seen as something that pits the elite city dwellers against people in the countryside who depend on their cars to get to work. Right? And so Emmanuel Macron ignored these two perspectives, and soon enough he had the Yellow Vest protests on his hands. Right? So even if you don't agree with all of these perspectives, it's important to understand how particular policies are perceived from the other perspectives in order to make sure that your policy is sustainable. I think I should stop here because I've taken already too much time. I have some more slides. I'm happy to get back to them, but I think I'd rather have a bit of discussion.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for that fascinating presentation, although I'll probably be traumatized by that picture of dragonfly eyes for a while now. We've got around 15 minutes, and so I'm very keen to get questions from the audience, so I'm not going to abuse my position. So what I would ask is, if you have any questions, just use the raise your hand functions, and then I can call you in. Right, Alessandro, you can unmute yourself and turn the camera on. I think that's possible now. And then Regis can come in after that. Alessandro, can you come in? All right.
Maybe you have to give him permission to turn on the microphone.
I think they already have, but maybe. Oh, you have an issue. Okay, Alessandro. Well, maybe we'll just skip to Regis, and if you want, you can write down your question on the chat bar, Alessandro. Regis, can you come in?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Nicola. Thanks for your talk, and I really enjoyed listening to to both pessimistic and optimistic takes on what globalization or where globalization is heading to. My question exactly relates on what is happening now with the globalization, especially all these trade sanctions and non-trade sanctions that are actually taking place. I was just wondering whether are we experiencing, based on the book, are we experiencing a retreat from globalization as we knew it before? Are we now back to the age of unilateralism, where every country actually uses economic tools at its disposal to exert pressure and also to influence foreign policy in other countries?
But I think what we're seeing is more an acceleration of a trend that was already there, and particularly in relation to China, right? So some of the measures that we're now seeing implemented against Russia, such as export restrictions, were also, of course, used by the U.S. administration vis-a-vis China, and so this geoeconomic narrative that highlights the dangers of vulnerability and of interconnection, it has really been supercharged by the crisis. I mean, just losing, if it really was true that it was just going to affect Russia, that of course would be significant, but it wouldn't mean the end of globalization, because you would still have, of course, globalization in the West, but also with all other countries that are friendly with the West. The big question is what it's going to mean, for me, is what it's going to mean for China. Because, and there are two possible readings. One would be to say, well, these massive sanctions that have been implemented by the West, they're going to spook China. So maybe China is going to be more cautious, particularly in making any moves towards Taiwan. And therefore, this will decelerate the decoupling that was happening between China and the West. But the other reading is that China will actually be spooked and say, well, now we have to double down on indigenous innovation, so that if the West ever was to implement these kinds of sanctions against us, we would not suffer so much, right? And so I think that's a likely reaction. China's probably going to be looking very closely what is the West doing with Russia, and see, well, what would that mean for us? And it's probably going to conclude that it has to become even more self-reliant in many aspects. What does that mean for the West? Well, it also means for the West that the West has to say, okay, what if we ever want to implement these kinds of sanctions vis-a-vis China? We have to be able to actually sustain that. And so we also have to reduce our dependency on China. So I think just Russia itself would not spell the end of globalization, but I think people playing it out, what it would mean in relationship with China, will accelerate these pre-existing trends towards reshoring, self-reliance that we've already been seeing.
Right. Would anyone else want to come in with another question? I know
there's one in the chat now.
Oh, there you go. So Alessandro says, fascinating talk, Nicolas. Thank you. Could you please briefly speak a bit more about the relationship between economic globalization / interdependence and foreign policy? Situation with Russia and possibly China seems to challenge this idea of long-lasting peace based on shared values and worldviews, but rather on economic markets and relationships.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. So for the establishment narrative, and something that I didn't emphasize a lot, this idea that international trade would lead to peace was a key assumption, really central assumption. So the architect of the multilateral trade regime, Cordell Hull, he was convinced that the Second World War was brought about partly because there was trade friction because of discrimination in international trade. And so he thought that if we have a multilateral system based on non-discrimination, that will lead to peace. And that's something that has carried over into the World Trade Organization itself. In 2005, the World Trade Organization published a pamphlet called 10 Benefits of the WTO. And the first one wasn't that the WTO the first benefit wasn't that it leads to greater wealth. The first benefit was that it leads to peace, right? So there was this firm conviction that if we only trade with each other, if we only treat each other without discrimination in our economic relation, that will bring about peace. And the geoeconomic narrative really fundamentally questions that. And I think it is more cogent in some areas than in others. So if you're trading toys, plastic toys with China, right, that there's no real risk from that. Like if that was cut down, that's not a huge problem. Or if you trade other products which you can easily substitute from other sources, there, of course, trading doesn't pose a huge risk. But as soon as you get into anything where there's a risk of sabotage, espionage, blackmail, which nowadays essentially everything connected with data, right? Everything that has either software or hardware where one country could siphon off data from the other one, you suddenly start seeing that as a security risk. And as data becomes an ever greater part of everything we do, of ever greater parts of the economy, that suspicion can become almost all pervasive. So I clearly, I mean, China's still going to import soybeans from the United States, but it's precisely that high technology trade which is going to is subject to ever greater scrutiny, and where you already seeing a decoupling, right? So when it comes to technology, you're seeing the US trying to decouple from China. When it comes to software or information technology products, you're seeing China trying to decouple from the West. And so in that way, we already have an end to globalization in certain spheres and certain sectors, at least as it pertains to the relationship between the West and China.
Excellent. I'm just checking if there are any more questions or asking if anyone else wants to come in.
So there's another question in the chat by Peter.
Right, there you go. So that one's from one of our colleagues, Peter Doran. So how will the drive for degrowth/decolonization or Western development models interrupt mid-long-term trade patterns and converge with development of a multipolar world? A nice and easy one there for you.
Well, so degrowth is one of the idea championed by this global threats narrative or sustainability narratives. But what's striking about it is not shared by any of the other narratives, right? So even if you go to the left-wing populists and the Green New Deal, they're all trying to combine the transition to renewable energy and decarbonization with growth, right? They're all implicitly saying we can have a better life in this new economy. And so I think that it has a very low chance, the degrowth idea has a very low chance of succeeding as a deliberate policy, right? So of course it can happen through catastrophes like COVID-19, through a war in Ukraine, right? You'll have degrowth in Russia and Ukraine this year. But given if we look at the universe of the narratives, it's really an idea that is pretty isolated and therefore will probably not be adopted as a conscious policy by anyone. What you do see is countries such as New Zealand expanding wider measures of human well-being, so moving away from purely economic growth to broader measures of well-being, which incorporate other aspects like access to basic services. At some point, they will hopefully have to include some kind of climate measures, like about the sustainability of your livelihood. But yeah, so it's still very much at the margins, this idea. With the multipolar world, wait, I don't think it's degrowth or decolonization is going to bring that about. It's decoupling, all right, that brings that about, and the emergence of rival spheres of influence. Again, Russia is not a great case study in terms of what it may mean for globalization, because Russia is a relatively isolated. But China is, of course, the largest trading partners for so many countries. So when faced with the choice of either the West or China, that will be very difficult for many countries, and many of them will go with China. Yeah, so great. So that was just a clarification from Peter. So
I was muted there. So we've got about 3 minutes left, and I can't see any more questions. So I'm going to ask you a question, if I can, very quickly. So my question is, the establishment narrative, right, which you identify in your book, it's really been the dominant strand of thinking for the past few decades. So do you think it is possible, in fact, do you think it's realistic to reform existing international institutions that to a large extent embody or at the very least are closely associated or informed by this narrative? Do you think it's possible to reform them in a way that would reflect the diversity of narratives or values which you highlight throughout your book? So I'm thinking in particular, for example, the WTO, the appellate body, is that something that's feasible?
Yes, I think it will have to happen, and it's already happening. I just think that they will take a much less central role as a result. Just to give you two examples. So to the extent that security becomes something that dominates states' approaches to international economic relations, well, the WTO can accommodate that because you have a security exception. But everything that happens in that space is essentially unregulated by the WTO. And so there may be a marginal role for the WTO to kind of specify the criteria, maybe have even a committee that looks at these national security claims and somehow tries to keep them in check. But it's clear that it's going to be a much less rule-governed world in that space. Another reason why I think it's becoming more marginal is because the World Trade Organization essentially is based on this idea that you exchange trade concessions, thereby and everybody dismantles their trade barriers in exchange for other countries dismantling their trade barriers, and that will create wealth, and so everybody is going to be better off. But what we're seeing is, especially in the United States, is that trade policy is increasingly seen as something that has to achieve particular substantive objective, right? So trade policy has to be worker-centric, so it has to help workers concretely, and has to help the environment in concrete ways, like it has to do something for climate. And that makes it much more difficult to reach agreement, because now you actually have to reach agreement on these substantive objectives. It's no longer, oh, we just dismantle barriers and increase our wealth, and everybody does with that wealth what they want to do. So, which is essentially a policy that is agnostic towards the ultimate objectives that countries are pursuing. In order to make progress on something like fishery subsidies or fossil fuel subsidies or worker rights, you actually have to agree on the substantive goals. And that's so much more difficult to do in a multilateral forum, almost impossible. Maybe in fishery subsidies, we're going to get there. We're never going to get there on worker rights, right? And so to the extent that trade policy becomes not so much just about wealth creation, but about substantive policy objectives, which are championed by these different narratives, the WTO is going to be increasingly marginalized, because you can only pursue them, at best, you can pursue them in regional free trade agreements, or as the US is trying to do, essentially unilaterally.
Yeah, I agree. But I think we'll have to leave it there. So I want to thank all the attendees for your presence, for your questions, but most of all, I want to thank you, Nicolas, again, for taking the time to be here with us today. I found it fascinating, eye-opening, and these are issues that clearly are going to become more and more relevant. So again, thanks for being here. I think I speak for everyone present.
Thanks so much for having me. Hopefully next time we can do this in person.
Oh yes, you're welcome at Queen's, the other Queen's, anytime.
Okay. Same here.
Take care.
Great to see you. Have a great day.